Proceed immediately to our last speaker, Dr. Stephen Sage, who was an American diplomat in Sofia during the years 1984 through 1986, afterwards earning a PhD in history, and he recently carried out research for the Claims Conference at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., documenting forced labor and ghettos in Bulgaria. A similar report was carried out by us regarding Romania. The German Finance Ministry awarded compensation to survivors on the basis of his findings, and he is now writing a book under the working title, The Holocaust in Bulgaria. The topic of his talk today, Labor Camps and Ghettos in Bulgaria. Dr. Sage.
How do I get my slides? Jewish men in 1941, in conjunction with the law for the protection of the nation, which was signed as a decree by His Majesty Tsar Boris III, and was enacted as law in January of 1941, the law for the defense of the nation. Now, under this law, Jewish men between the ages of 20 and their late 40s were required to serve. There's a rescue hoax which claims that the forced labor was actually a benign excuse for refusal to deport the Jews into German hands. Really? But the forced labor targeting Jews started well before the start of the killing phase of the Nazi final solution. That is to say, before any German demands to deport the Jews. So, coordinated with the Law for the Defense of the Nation, the ZZN as it's abbreviated in Bulgarian, the express purpose was indeed punitive. The purpose of the forced labor was punitive. But, to caveat that, it was economical too, because by these means, the Bulgarian state extracted a lot of low-cost prisoner labor from men who had committed no crimes whatsoever. And they worked mainly during the construction season, the warmer months of the year, on building roads. This was a motorway project, mainly. There were some river diversion projects as well, but most of the men worked on motorways, which drew inspiration from the much-hyped Autobahn project, the Reichsautobahn, was in Germany, and its extension to the roads of Bulgaria was a pet project of Prince Kirill, Knaz Kirill, who was the brother of Tsar Boris III. Now, what are motorways for? They convey automobile traffic, cars, right? But in the case of Bulgaria, any Jew who had a car had already had to surrender it to the authorities, motorcycles too. And if you don't want to believe that, you can go to the Centralny Državny Archiv, Central State Archive of Bulgaria, and there's a nice file folder there, a pretty thick one, that details every car taken away from a Jewish owner. Some of them have photographs. It's a very fascinating file, especially for car enthusiasts. I looked at it about 20 years ago. Unfortunately, we didn't have the funds then from the Holocaust Museum in Washington to Xerox or otherwise obtain copies of those files, but I wish we had. Now, as for context of the forced labor, it's true that over a decade prior to 1941, Bulgaria had established the practice of youth brigades, or citizen brigades, for intensive labor on national infrastructure projects. And indeed, back during that era, many other countries did much the same. For example, under Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, the American Civilian Conservation Corps was established. So, some apologists for the forced labor in Bulgaria like to cite this example of national infrastructure projects in other countries as well. But, again, this is a false take on the whole situation, because in Bulgaria, the Shoah-era forced labor specifically targeted Jews in a punitive manner. Now, we can discuss the sources of the forced labor in Bulgaria. What are the sources? Documentation is actually relatively abundant, far more so, in fact, than for many other instances of Shoah-era forced labor, such as the Hungarian Jewish Labor Corps, for which documentation is very sparse, actual documentation. In Bulgaria, the principal primary sources consist of voluminous records of the actual units, battalion by battalion. And these are kept among the holdings of the military archive of Bulgaria at Veliko Trnovo, a lovely town in north-central Bulgaria, a mountain town. Now, working with Vadim Altskan of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, I obtained copies of these records for the Holocaust Museum there and used them to document individual compensation cases. Payments were then approved, this is back in 2004, by the German Foreign Ministry. Besides the unit rosters themselves, which are very meticulous actually, there's also photographs. This one here is from 1941. The guys are not out for a swim. They have their shirts off because they've been doing very hard work in very hot conditions. Later, at this time in 1941, the men had the status as labor troops of the Bulgarian army. But subsequently, in 1942, 43, 44, the military status was withdrawn, and they're no longer appearing in any kind of uniformed conditions. There's also some film footage from 1941. The conditions of work were not bad, actually, as things go, not too bad in 1941, but in subsequent years, men were treated as prisoners and were subjected to overwork, harsh conditions, and indignities. This was at the request, incidentally, this lowering of the status of the forced laborers was at the request of the Germans, who inspected the place, the camps of the Bulgarian Jewish forced laborers. Towards the beginning of 1942, it was the German official Konstantin Hirl, the head of the German Labor Corps, who then recommended that the military status of the Bulgarian Jews be dropped. For the years 1942 to 1944, a principal source then for this more difficult period, the principal source consists of pre-trial depositions and courtroom testimony of the first Holocaust trial in history, namely Sofia People's Court Panel 7, which convened from March the 7th to April the 2nd of 1945. Note, the war in Europe is still on then, still a shooting war, but Bulgaria convened a full-scale Holocaust trial. In the indictment, there were 64 accused Bulgarian perpetrators, some 333 witnesses providing depositions and sworn testimony. And this is really a fascinating trove. It amounts to a first draft history of the Holocaust in Bulgaria. And surprise, surprise, in all of that testimony, in all those pretrial depositions, there is not a single mention of a quote-unquote rescue. Nary a one. Okay. So another source is memoirs. There are a few. Probably the first and most thorough was that of Eli Baruch, and he was also, incidentally, besides having been a forced laborer, he was one of the judges on the tribunal of People's Court Panel number 7. He titled his memoir, Our Sufferings. So you can see this was not Boy Scout camp, it wasn't a picnic. This was punitive forced labor, perhaps not nearly as lethal as, say, working on the rock pile at Mauthausen, but it's not the kind of place you'd want to send your kid to. Well, maybe some kids. Anyway. The men were forced to labor during the warmer seasons. In the winter, they were furloughed back to their families who were living under ghetto conditions at that time. Now, in March 1945, the time of this trial, there's an interesting case which is a bright spot in the whole picture of Jewish forced labor in Bulgaria. It's the case of Colonel Tsvetan Mumjiev, who, during 1943, when he was in charge of Jewish forced labor in Bulgaria, he, as a by-the-book military man and a man of great personal conscience and great personal courage, he initiated court-martial actions against those junior officers and non-commissioned officers who were committing depredations against Jewish labor conscripts. There were beatings, withdrawal of rations, extortion of funds, charging money for brief furloughs to visit their families, etc. Mumjiev not only intervened in that way, but he also, in 1943, when the families of the Greek Jews were under his command were being deported as part of the deportations that were just discussed by the previous speaker, when this happened, Mumjiev took steps to shield the laborers themselves from deportation. Now, how did he do this? He, instead of releasing them, instead of mustering them out at the end of the construction season, he kept them on the books as under his command, as labor troops under his command, and thus prevented their deportation. To actually care for them, since they didn't have homes to go back to in Greece anymore, their families had been deported, he arranged that they would be staying in the city of Plovdiv. Mumjiev himself was from Plovdiv, and he had personal connections among the Jewish community there. So if Yad Vashem is looking for another perspective righteous among the nations, give fair consideration, I ask of you, to Colonel Tsvetan Mumjiev. Certainly he deserves it because at the trial, which I mentioned, the People's Court session, panel number 7, there was a petition by the surviving Greek Jews, actually several petitions, on behalf of Mumjiev, in which the survivors asked that the court drop the charges against this man, and indeed he was acquitted. He did stand trial. There is testimony from him, but he was fortunately acquitted, and his grandson is currently a prominent artist also in Plovdiv. So, with that bright spot, we can now turn to the topic of ghettos in Bulgaria. As with forced labor, apologists for Bulgaria's policies have occasionally tried to spin the removal of the Jews of Sofia to the provinces as some kind of gimmick to protect them from, to keep them out of Nazi hands. That's really imaginative. In fact, I would say it deserves a prize for creative imagination, the Joe Goebbels Prize. But again, on the basis of, facts, it ain't necessarily so. So, to briefly review the chronology and process of Bulgaria's Shoah-era Jewish ghettos, we'll turn to the sources. Ghettoization was the first major task of Alexander Belev's Commissariat for Jewish Affairs, once that agency was established in August of 1942. The records of the Commissariat are the major perpetrator source for the ghettos and a lot of other things. And I might add that at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, those records take up about 340 microfilm reels, all of them pretty full. So it's a tremendous trove of material. I can get this moving now. Oh, here we go. Yeah, the principal source are the records of the Commissariat of Jewish Affairs. Now, Belef had been tutored in Germany for this assignment, and the process of ghettoization follows, to a certain extent, German practice in some areas. This slide I'm showing you here now is the decree for the ghetto in Plovdiv, established very soon after the Commissariat for Jewish Affairs began its actual hands-on business. And under this decree, there's a lot of detailed regulations on where Jews are forbidden, curfew hours, and hours in which they can go to market, which was always after the good stuff had already been bought, et cetera, et cetera. Belef learned this stuff under German tutelage. He'd been tutored in Germany for his assignment as Commissariat for Jewish Affairs, and the Commissariat was granted plenipotentiary authority for the quasi-legalized robbing, uprooting, segregating, confining, and deporting of all the Jews of Bulgaria, including those of the occupied and administered zones of adjacent Yugoslavia and Greece, as we just heard from Zdravka. Now, ghettos comprised an integral part of the Commissariat's process supposed to lead toward deportation. But the perpetrators studiously avoided using the term ghetto. They referred instead to a Jewish quarter, that is to say, in Bulgarian, Evreysky kvartal, in those places where relatively compact Jewish neighborhoods already existed. In Sofia, as you can see on the map here, in Sofia with the blue line drawn around what was the effective ghetto, in Sofia that meant a district informally called Yuchbunar, that's a Turkish word meaning three wells or three fountains, Yuchbunar plus some adjacent streets. Jews residing elsewhere in Sofia had already, before August of 42, they had already been compelled to relocate there prior to the ghettoization decree. Now, de facto open ghettos in provincial cities soon followed that of Plovdiv and Sofia in autumn of 1942. The only place I found where perpetrator documents actually used the term ghetto per se, was a couple of times, even then it was limited, was in Skopje, in Bulgarian occupied and administered, but not formally annexed, Bulgarian occupied and administered Macedonia. And there, the Jewish population in Skopje was already residing in a fairly compact part of town. In pre-war times, this was not a medieval-style ghetto, gated ghetto per se, but a largely, if not exclusively, Jewish neighborhood. In many other places, the Jewish-occupied dwellings were interspersed among those of Gentile neighbors. Jewish dwellings were required to be marked with a placard reading Evreisko Zhilishte, or Jewish residence. And as a practical matter of everyday life, Jews out on the streets, even when they were allowed to, were faced oftentimes harassment by uniformed or sometimes ununiformed fascist gangs, the Braniks and Ratniks, beatings, shakedowns, extortions, etc. This kind of thing went on with impunity during the 2 years of ghettoization in Bulgaria. The Jewish ghettos in each city were managed by an appointed official called by the Commissariat the delegat, who enforced his decrees through a Jewish council, that is to say, something very much like a Judenrat in other parts of Europe. This Jewish council consisting usually of 4 or 5 members, prominent people in the community, the Jewish community, drafted for this purpose, usually unwillingly, but they had to do it. Whether compact or dispersed, the initial ghetto decrees took the form of restrictions, including curfews and severe restrictions on lots of facilities being placed off limits. You couldn't go to the cinema, you couldn't go to public parks, that sort of thing. Jews could shop for severely rationed basic groceries. And of course, all Jews above the age of 10 were forced to wear the Bakelite small yellow Magen David badge affixed to their outer clothing. So the arrangements in Bulgaria, the ghetto arrangements, come into the category of open ghettos. They're not walled ghettos like the famous ghetto in Warsaw. Why no wall? Why the difference? Why is it not walled? And why no walled ghettos in Bulgaria? Why open ghettos? The question is more reasonably phrased. Why was there a wall around the Warsaw ghetto more the exception? Why was this more the exception than the rule in the widespread archipelago of Jewish ghettos throughout much of Axis-dominated Europe? Why? Because the Warsaw ghetto was set up in 1940, prior to the advent of the killing phase, prior to the Endlösung, the final solution. So the Warsaw ghetto was intended at the outset to be a semi-permanent living arrangement. Furthermore, the wall there incarcerated a much larger population than any ghetto in Bulgaria. And the very fact of the wall was socially disruptive. That is to say, broadly inconveniencing so-called Aryan Poles as well as Jewish victims. The Germans didn't care. They decreed as they pleased, exercising carte blanche in a territory they had occupied after a vicious shooting war in Poland. But, by contrast, Bulgaria wasn't occupied. There was a limited German troop strength, but they weren't occupiers per se. The country was still ruled by a Bulgarian government affiliated with the Nazi New Order, voluntarily affiliated with the Nazi New Order. Ghettos in Bulgaria were initiated in autumn 1942 within the larger framework of the final solution, which by then was underway. And the ghettos in Bulgaria were not conceived as protracted living arrangements, that is to say, when they came into being. The ghettos were intended as interim transit measures to segregate the Jewish population from mainstream Bulgarians and from other minorities so as to facilitate the process of roundup and deportation. In the late spring and early summer of 1943, the next year, the conditions in the provincial ghettos suddenly and markedly worsened. Why? This was because thousands of destitute Jews evicted from their homes in Sofia were foisted onto the Jewish communities in about 40 provincial cities. For some, basic shelter was not always immediately available, and that's the visual topic of this final slide I'm going to show you. This is a family of people from Sofia who were evicted from their homes there and sent to Khaskovo in southeastern Bulgaria. Proper housing was not yet available. The family, having arrived, has to sleep on the street. When people finally did find housing, it was unhygienic. People were vastly overcrowded in apartments. They were forced guests in other Jewish homes for most of them. Widespread also was malnutrition. The commissariat had intended this to last for only a few weeks or months on a schedule that had predicated all Jews to be deported from Bulgaria, including Greater Bulgaria, the occupied territories, to be deported by the end of September 1943. Meanwhile, more facilities were placed off limits and curfews were made more stringent. Jews were furthermore forbidden to work productively for remuneration. But the ultimate move of deportation, as we know, was unexpectedly suspended. That left the Jews in limbo with ghetto restrictions still in place. So they're still in ghettos. Where's the rescue? In this way, the ghettos took on a protracted life not originally intended by the Commissariat of Jewish Affairs, whose writ was, of course, deportation for annihilation. A meager upkeep of the Jews was reluctantly provided by the so-called Jewish Community Fund, which consisted of monies confiscated from Jewish bank accounts and from the sale of confiscated Jewish property. If you want the details on that, read the book by Roman Avramov, Spasenie Padenie. Now, this situation of ghettos lasted then, this protracted situation lasted until September 1944, when the Red Army crossed the Danube and when Bulgaria switched sides and hastily annulled all of the anti-Jewish legislation. That meant a total of about 2 years of ghetto existence for most Jews. During that time, the ghetto curfews and restrictions remained in force. Violators were subjected to fines and in many cases were sent to a special concentration camp on the Danube, the port town of Somovit, and from there later to a camp at Kailuka near Pleven, just south of Pleven, where in July of 1944 a fire took the lives of 11 Jews incarcerated there, a fire which is widely believed to have been deliberately set, arson, by some radical anti-Semites, gangs. The sources for protracted, I'll conclude quickly. The sources for protracted life of the ghettos consist of commissariat decrees, operating budgets of the ghettos, property confiscation records, and records of the auction sale of seized Jewish property. Many of these records are archived. I'll conclude with a rhetorical question. Is it really possible that punitive forced labor, wholesale expropriation of assets and property, eviction, social segregation, enforced malnutrition, arbitrary imprisonment, restriction on movement, and ghettoization are measures consistent with a rescue, or were these measures more compatible with the established Nazi process aimed at culminating in deportation for physical annihilation? Thank you.
Thank you very much.